Wall Street and the financial sector in general make things as difficult to understand as possible so that people like you and I can figure it out. And they make their money. And we saw what happens when it's not regulated. About a decade ago, we all remember what happened. The bubble burst, subprime mortgages, and hedge funds. And hedge funds get thrown around a lot. And hedge funds, what they are, and it's a trope now, right? In movies and TV. Oh, you're a hedge fund manager. What do you do? I don't understand it. I don't know. Can you explain it to me? Sure. And then they have some kind of brief explanation, and people go, well, I don't understand. You're not supposed to. There are people who make a lot of money on the stock market, a ton. And those people do that both by jumping on companies on their way up and piling on companies on their way down and finding a way to make money. And this all reminds me of what caused the massive crunch, the huge absolute destruction of the economy back in the late 2000s. And what's interesting is, of course, people will say, well, Shannon, you're Canadian. What do you care? Because what happens with the American economy has a dramatic effect on Canadian economy. The Canadian economy is much smaller. We are right next to the US. When they get hit, we get hit. It may be to a lesser extent, but we still get hit. Now, trying to understand this, I thought, all right, I got to put this on the board because honestly, even when you read it, and I've read it, and I've watched videos on it, and if I get anything wrong, go ahead, correct me in the comment section below because it's weird. So what we've got is stock in Blips and Chits, and that's the name of the arcade that you go to if you're in Rick and Morty land, right? You go to Blips and Chits. So I'm using that as the example. So you've got stock in these guys, and in the current pandemic marketplace, things aren't necessarily going well. So I'm using them as an example of GameStop, and we'll come down to this number because it gets interesting. So Johnny Canuck owns the stock, right? I'm crossing sports. I don't care. It's on the entertainment guide. Doesn't matter. So Johnny Canuck owns the stock. Now along comes Tiny Rick. He's a short seller. So he's like, okay, I'm going to borrow this stock from you. I'm going to give it back to you. I'm just borrowing it. He goes, all right, fine. Cool. Whatever. So Tiny Rick pays a little, fee to Johnny Canuck in order to borrow the stock. It's not really his. But now he's going to sell it. So he's going to sell it to Grogu over here, better known as Tiny Yoda. Or Baby Yoda. Tiny Rick, Baby Yoda. Grogu gets it for, say, $10. Right? Now, Tiny Rick borrowed it at $10 from Johnny Canuck. So what does Tiny Rick want that stock to do? He wants it to drop. So he can buy it back, and it doesn't have to be the one he sold Grogu necessarily, but he wants to buy back stock. He wants to buy back the stock at a lesser amount so that when he returns it to Johnny Canuck, he pockets the difference. So the stock gets sold here for $10. It comes back to Tiny Rick at $6. He gives it back here. He has pocketed $4 for that stock. That is as simple as I could pare it down to. And it's weird. This to me is something that I'm really surprised is 100% legal. I'm really surprised it's 100% legal. Because if you get enough guys doing this, you can manipulate stock prices. If everybody's selling a stock, that price will go down. If everybody's buying a stock, that price will go up. And this is what we've seen. So, GameStop. GameStop has been having financial trouble for years. GameStop is also not necessarily the most scrupulous corporation, let's just say. But in terms of comparison with stuff, let's say EA, they have a reputation that's better than EA. But 140% of their stock was shorted, meaning 140% of their stocks were in the process of this. So it was being driven down. So they saw a stock that was down and a company that was hurting, and they said, well, we're going to bet against it. It's all a form of gambling. And this is the problem. When we're in the stock market, which is a form of gambling anyways, but now we're gambling on the gamble. You get into an area where you end up with another subprime mortgage situation where it can crash, where financial institutions And we all know what they've done. And we know that coming out of 2008, they basically weren't punished. They were given money. They were given money. Too big to fail. We got to give them money. What did they do? They did a bunch of really shady things with money. And so now we have to give them more. We'll put regulations on them, but don't worry, those regulations will disappear over time. They'll say, these regulations are kind of stifling. Yeah, they're there because you did bad things. Well, can you take them off? All right, sure. So Reddit comes along and talks about this. And Wall Street Bets. And this is the part that I wanted to take a look at, because I understand Reddit is huge. I understand there's a lot of people on it. But Reddit alone won't move the stock market. Reddit alone, not that much. But what happened is, as soon as people are buying this stock and the price starts going up, if you're Tiny Rick and you're a short seller, well, now you want that stock back before it goes up further. So now you've got short sellers buying it back, and when the short sellers start buying it back en masse, the price goes up further. Now you've got all these other algorithm things too, where it's basically buying stocks for you. I may be old, but I'm not going to let a machine buy and sell stocks for me. If I ever got into the stock market, and I'm not leaning towards that at all, seems like a really good way to lose your money. I do have RRSP, I do have a TFSA, I do have a certain stake in financial markets, but and this will affect people's 401ks as well. Some of them have been decimated and they don't even realize it yet. But, and who knows, maybe mine's going to drop too. But, and that's where it gets into the whole diversify where your money is, so that that kind of thing won't necessarily destroy your savings. But these short sellers get into it, and now these machines that see an algorithm, they go, oh, look, GameStop's going up. We'd better buy into that. So we're going to buy you stock in GameStop because it went up 10% yesterday. So that drives the price up. There was a report yesterday that one of the hedge funds had to borrow, I think it's $2.3 billion to cover their losses with this. Now, I've seen people say it breaks the stock market. I think what it does is that it reveals that there's things going on in the stock market that really shouldn't be. And it's similar. So when we had the subprime mortgage thing being bet, they were betting you weren't going to be able to cover your mortgage. That was the bet, was we're going to get these mortgages, we're going to buy them up, we don't think people are going to be able to pay them off. So banks are like, I'm not going to be able to get rid of these mortgages are crap. And they start selling them. They start packaging together and selling them. And it became this whole thing where anybody could buy a house, but almost everybody could lose their house coming out of it. And now what we're seeing here is it just, I've always watched the stock market, and I remember when I was a kid watching it and watching it go up and watching it drop. And I've watched this during this past year where people are hurting. There are people who are in danger of losing their homes. People have lost jobs. And the stock market keeps going up. And I keep thinking, how? How is this possible that while the economy is struggling and there are so many people out of work across the United States, so many stocks are still performing really, really well? And the question of a bubble has started to slowly emerge. Like, we're looking at a stock bubble. Where I remember back in March, I thought this is going to absolutely decimate it. And it did initially, and then it started going up again. Even though earnings were showing as being down for a lot of companies, it's fine. And it all moves around, and it's still going up. Over a long period of time, the stock market will always hit new highs. That's just the way that the economy, that's the way money works. But we are in a position right now where, to me, it feels like it's a bubble. And seeing this and seeing 140% of GameStop was shorted. So think about that. That means there was more stock being shorted than actually existed. So when short sellers started selling off, there wasn't enough stock for all of them to do it. That shouldn't be legal. I see that and I think that shouldn't be legal. But this is where a question I ask myself is, are we getting into a situation where are there short sellers dealing with other short sellers dealing with, like, how far down the rabbit hole does this go? What else goes on Wall Street that we don't hear about that could be affecting everybody else. Now, BlackBerry traded up. It was also apparently swept up in this. Today, both Toronto Dominion and RBC in Canada here, their websites went down. And apparently it's related to stock trading and financials. I look at this and I think this sounds like something that could eventually crash the economy. This sounds like something that, again, your Tiny Rick here has taken a bunch of risk. But if Tiny Rick works for one of these huge hedge funds, and there's a million different Tiny Ricks making this bet against this stock, and all of them end up being wrong because that stock goes up, that is a hedge fund that just went out of business. And apparently there are hedge funds that have basically had to declare bankruptcy over this. But there'll be more hedge funds to replace them. Don't you worry. Don't you worry. I never underestimate greed. And it's not a nationality thing. Globally, there's always going to be somebody greedy who wants to step in and go, we can do this better. Coming out of the crash in 2008, I remember thinking, wow, I hope they can prevent that from ever happening again. And then it was maybe 6 months after that crash that I started hearing reports from financial news channels up here, as well as reading through like Wall Street Journal and various financial papers, that actually, while there's all this regulation, we can't guarantee it won't happen again, because it probably will. Wasn't exactly awe-inspiring. And while Reddit started it, because of the way this is all set up, it didn't take much. It really didn't take much. And again, it was like the subprime mortgages all over again. All it took was one. All it took was one to suddenly, well, this doesn't work. And then everything fell. It's a house of cards, and all it takes is just one guy coming in and just chucking something at it, and the whole thing falls. And it shows how fragile it is. Because again, this isn't just Reddit started it, but Reddit's not the reason that we see all of this huge amount of money in GameStop. Now, at last I looked, GameStop, their stock had dropped 38% today. It is heavily overvalued. And it's going to change again. But there are other stocks now that people are picking up on. That this subreddit, Wall Street Bets, is basically saying, okay, now get into this and get into this. And there are people who are going to make money on this. And there are people with the hedge funds that are going to lose a lot of money on this. And again, I think the fact that the financial dealings and the way that they work, the fact that banks and that these traders make sure that what they're doing is so hard to understand and follow, that's the point. That's the point. Because if they just make it really simple, people will say that shouldn't be legal. This number here should never be legal. You should never have more than 100% of a company that is shorted. That should never happen. And there are other companies that it happens with. So, yeah. And I keep an eye on it because, again, it affects the entire economy. And if it affects the entire economy, well, YouTubers, we make our money through AdSense revenues. AdSense revenues come from corporations. Corporations take a massive hit. Corporations may stop spending as much money on advertising as they normally would, because that's one of the first budgets you cut. And if that's the case, then we here on YouTube would feel the pinch. And that's why it's important to talk about it. So it may not be an overly entertaining discussion, but it just feels like it's important. Because it does feel like there's another massive dive coming for the stock market and for the economy, because we do have, they call them corrections. And those corrections cost people billions and billions of dollars. And keep in mind, in the end, when the banks were doing all this stuff with subprime mortgages and they got bailed out, the people who got hurt by all this wasn't the banks. The banks just got a huge bailout from the government. They were fine. And most of the big financial wizards in charge of everything, they were fine. They came out of it okay. Arrests? Nah. It's fine. It's white-collar crime. It's no big deal. People lost their homes. People lost their savings. People lost everything. So the people who are losing money right now, and when you hear, oh, that hedge fund went under, haha, I don't think those are the people who are going to feel the pinch. I think it's going to be the people who have money invested in those hedge funds. People who may not even realize they have money. And again, I come back to myself. There may be money that I've lost through this. And that's who's going to pay the price. So that's why it's important to talk about this, because the people who actually pay in the end, it's not the millionaires and billionaires. It's not. They find a way to make sure that it's the regular everyday person, regular everyday taxpayer is the one that pays the price in the end. And it might be the price you pay is, in some cases with subprime mortgages, it's your house. And in other cases, you may very well lose your life savings. You may lose your retirement funds. You may lose a fund you had for your kids put together so they could go to college. They'll be protected. So it is an interesting thing for people to get into. And again, I remember thinking as a kid, like, I wouldn't mind getting stocks. And I never got into it because, again, I feel like you have to understand this before you're going to get into the stock market. You have to have a complete knowledge of how all of this works and understand the hedge fund thing. Understand all of it, because if you're going to really get into the stock market and really start to try to find a way to make money doing it, you have to understand all of the other shady stuff that goes on behind the scenes and know not to jump onto a stock just because it's going up and start asking why. Especially in GameStop's case, where they've been reporting losses for years. And brick and mortar stores, brick and mortar businesses, they're going to have trouble. It's not just pandemic. Before the pandemic, they were having a lot of trouble, brick and mortar stores. And this has just made it worse. This has just exacerbated the problem. So for some of them, you're going to see a lot of people out of work. You're going to see a lot of stores closing down, companies having to go to just online sales to try to save some cash. And again, who gets squeezed in that? Not those companies, not necessarily. It's usually the regular, everyday people. And that's the shame of it all. So there you go. Hopefully this has helped. Again, if I got any of this wrong, let me know in the comment section below. Because again, I've done my best to explain how I see it and try to make it as simple as possible. But thank you guys so much for your patience and your time. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happen upon this video. And for people wondering about the NFL, I will be doing a look at the Super Bowl and previewing the Super Bowl over the next probably couple of days. Probably tomorrow would be the best day to do a preview for the Super Bowl. So thank you guys so much for everything. I will talk to you again soon.